a dynamic withdrawal strategy in retirement. Let's break it down on this episode of the Hawaii Retirement Show. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Hawaii Retirement Show. Today's episode, we're talking dynamic withdrawal strategy in retirement. This is kind of the last episode in a series of discussions on different withdrawal strategies in retirement. We talked about the 4% rule in a previous episode. We talked about the bucket strategy, and this will wrap it up here, just going over the dynamic withdrawal strategies. And with all these distribution strategies, I mean, you're trying to find the best way to deal with market volatility, to deal with inflation, to deal with longevity risk, right? The risk of running out of money later on in retirement, so you don't want to be taking too much out early. But at the same time, you're competing with not taking out too little, right? Money unspent is life unlived, and not taking out, enough money to enjoy yourself in retirement, right? And there's the sequence of returns risk. That's kind of the elephant in the room with all of this. So I think to start with, I talked about this maybe a year or two back on what a retirement typically looks like for most people. And this might not apply to you, but statistically, most people fall into this smile shape pattern of retirement. And it starts with the go-go, then it's the slow go, and ends with the no-go. And what I mean by that is your go-go, you enter retirement, you cross the finish line, you feel like you made it, you're refreshed, you hit the ground running, you spend a lot of money, you start traveling, you're enjoying yourself. And eventually, you get tired of sitting in the TSA lines and at the airports, and you kind of checked off a bunch of things from your bucket list. And you enter your slow go, right? And this is the middle part of your retirement where you kind of slow down a little. And your spending drops down. You kind of settle into this lifestyle, and then it ramps back up, your spending that is, at the end of your retirement in the no-go phase when you're not able to do a lot of things, but spending increases for, different health reasons, aging, and end-of-life stuff, right? So it's this smile-shaped pattern. And I think that you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at any of these distribution strategies, and understand, I'm not advocating for, just going wild early in retirement, right? Because there is that longevity risk, but also understanding you got to enjoy yourself, right? I mean, while you have the health, while you're able to go out there and enjoy yourself, don't limit yourself and have regrets later on for not spending some of that money, not taking those trips, not making those memories, right? So circling back to sequence of return risk, and I think I talked about this on the last episode about the bucket strategy. The sequence of return risk is understanding that there are significant considerations to where if you retire in a down market, right? If you retire and then you enter this, a couple year stretch of no or poor returns, right? That'll impact your retirement portfolio for the rest of your life, right? Now, if you enter retirement at a time when the market is on a tear, like let's say you retired in 2010 up until now, hey, market's been on a tear, and sequence of return risk isn't going to be on your radar, right? Because your portfolio is off and running. Okay, and so that's where we enter this, 4% rule. The dynamic withdrawal strategy is to mitigate and minimize some of these risks of pulling out money too early in down markets and having these big hits on your portfolio. So I've heard some people say, well, if the market's down, I just won't pull from my portfolio. And when it's up, I'll just pull out the gains, right? I'll just live on my returns in up years. And the problem with that is you're really talking about an all or none strategy. So you're pretty much saying if the market's down, I'm just going to sit in and watch Netflix. And if it's up, I'll be able to take that trip and enjoy myself, right? And I think there's a better solution than just the all or none. And that's where these dynamic withdrawal strategy, 4% rule bucket strategies kind of come in. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to live in this all or none, well, market's down, ho-hum, I'm just going to not touch it. That's fine. There's just a little bit more nuance to it, and I think a better approach in these different strategies. So we're talking dynamic withdrawal strategy. Okay, the opposite would be a static withdrawal strategy, which would be the 4% rule. Remember we talked about you start with a safe withdrawal rate, your 4%, and you adjust up every year for inflation, and you just kind of ride that out. That's static, right? You just keep adjusting up and keep taking out your distributions. A dynamic withdrawal strategy is going to be a little more in tune with adjusting to the market, having some parameters that we'll talk about on maybe how much inflation do we adjust for. And also, too, it allows for a little more nuance in like personal changes, in your life and whatnot. So there's several different versions of a dynamic withdrawal, dynamic distribution, dynamic spending strategy, right? The most popular one out there, in my opinion, is the Guyton-Klinger, the guardrails approach. And, you can Google Guyton-Klinger. There's a nice white paper that they did outlining all their parameters and how they approached it and the testing and what their results were. Michael Kitces has this, I've seen something he wrote on a ratcheting strategy for a distribution strategy. I seen Vanguard had a paper, had a study on their version of the dynamic spending strategy. And so sometimes you'll hear it called guardrails or floor and ceiling approach, right? Because you kind of set these parameters, these upper and lower limits, and you make these adjustments year over year accordingly. So it's worth pointing out that we can see with all of these strategies, not just the dynamic withdrawal strategies, there's a lot of variation in opinions, which then leads to, at least the understanding that there's no perfect right approach, right? There's a lot of opinions, but I think there's educated opinions, and you should take these into account. I do. I'm very fond of the dynamic withdrawal strategy. I do follow something similar, a guardrails approach, in my own, advising retirement practice. But there's no perfect strategy. And as you'll see, even with how these different strategies are implemented, there's a lot of varying opinions on the parameters that you're going to set. So we'll go through kind of an example of a dynamic withdrawal strategy. This is a simplified version, just to kind of conceptually get you to understand it. If you follow like the Guyton-Klinger rules, it can be a little more complicated and convoluted. There's a lot going on there, but I'm going to give you a simplified, just overview conceptually of what this would look like, and so you can understand how to implement it or how it operates. Okay, so you set these parameters, okay? And the first parameter you're going to set is you're going to determine what's my initial withdrawal rate. Now, the 4% rule could apply here, right? Could be 3.5%, could be 4.5%, 5%. You determine what is my initial withdrawal rate, okay? That's the first parameter. Next, you're going to set your inflation parameters, okay? And what I mean by that is, if inflation is up in year 2, you're going to adjust up for inflation. But the parameters could be, I'm going to set a cap on inflation. So if inflation is 7%, I'm going to cap it at 6%, right? If inflation for the year is 4%, no problem, you adjust it up 4%. But you can set a cap on this, 6%, 7%, 5%, and say, well, I'm going to adjust my distributions from the previous year up for inflation, but cap it off at a certain point. Now, the other parameter around inflation is that some of these dynamic withdrawal strategies, you're not going to make any inflation adjustments in a down year, right? So let's say, we have a 2008 or whatever it might be, we got this down year, and inflation might be 3%, 4%, you're just going to ignore that and not adjust up for inflation in a down year. And again, this goes back into, for obvious reasons, I guess, you're not trying to take big distributions in down years for the sake of longevity risk and sequence of returns. Okay, so we have our initial withdrawal rate. We got our inflation parameters. Then you're going to look at an upper and lower threshold, right? These are your guardrails or your ceiling and your floors. And what these are is you set a percentage of, if my distribution adjusted for inflation hits this upper guardrail, this percentage of my portfolio, then I am going to adjust it either down or up. Depending if it hit the upper guardrail, then you adjust it down. If it hit the lower guardrail, you adjust it up, right? And the reason for this, again, is if you hit the upper guardrail, it signals, okay, you might be spending a little too much of your portfolio. Let's dial it back down. Same thing with if you hit the lower guardrail, okay, you're leaving a lot of meat on the bone here. Let's increase these distributions and dial it up a little. So that way you're not taking out too little and not enjoying your hard-earned money in retirement. The rebalancing frequencies varies between these different dynamic with distribution strategies, and that's something to consider as well. But those are the basic parameters: initial safe withdrawal rate, your inflation parameters, your upper and lower guardrails. And then you're going to kind of do this dance year over year and find out where you're at and adjust to kind of stay within your desired range. It can get much more complicated than that. I just want to give kind of a general overview of what it might look like. There's a lot of pros to this. I think it does a great job of being a little more dialed in than like a static 4% rule. As far as a distribution strategy, but there are some cons to it, right? In some years, you're going to make cutbacks or you're not going to have any increase in distributions. And again, the cons are also, there's a lot of variation in opinion, and it's hard to say for certain whether this is successful in that you will, spend enough. Like you might do this whole dynamic withdrawal strategy and come to find out 15, 20 years in, well, I could have been spending way more early on in retirement. That's a possibility, right? But there's no perfect strategy. And with a lot of, as you know, with investments and with a lot of this stuff, there's no way to know what the future holds. I think something that wasn't touched on in the 4% rule, the bucket strategy, and this dynamic distribution strategy, it kind of was, and I talked about it in the bucket strategy, is peeling back the onion a little further. So we've been talking about distribution strategies from your retirement portfolio. But you can take it a step further and sort of, I don't want to use the word bucket, but you can start to portion out different segments of your portfolio for different purposes, right? You have your essential living expenses, right? And that would be a good place to maybe use the 4% rule or the dynamic withdrawal strategy on this portfolio that is set to, use for your essential living expenses. Now, if you satisfy that, well, then you can look at another portion of your portfolio as maybe your fund number. Well, this is kind of discretionary, right? And you can approach that maybe a little differently. And you could take it even a step further, which I like to do. And you have this third kind of portfolio around aging, long-term care, health, and all these other expenses that you might not need later on down the road. And you might use a different distribution strategy, a different investment strategy for each one of those, purposed out buckets of your portfolio. So yeah, there's just so much to it. There's a lot of nuance. And there's a lot of ways to view it and approach it. There's a lot of varying opinions. I think it's good to not be dogmatic about it and be stuck in and dug in on any one strategy. I think there's a lot of good and bad from all of them. But you got to find out which one works for you. And it's okay to start with one distribution strategy and maybe you start to alter it and it starts to look like another distribution strategy. You don't have to be kind of dug into the parameters. You gotta take things as they come. One example would be, let's say you're using the dynamic with distribution strategy, and let's say your daughter is getting married in Greece, and you wanna cover most of it. It's going to cost you, I don't know, whatever it might be, $100,000 or more, right? But this doesn't really factor into the parameters of your dynamic distribution strategy? The answer is, maybe not to say, well, I can't do it. Sorry, honey, we're not going to do this thing. Maybe it's to take out those distributions and alter your parameters, alter your thinking about, well, I'm going to take this big distribution that wasn't really accounted for in my distribution strategy, and I'll alter things to kind of compensate for that later. And that's just an example of not being so dug in to say, these are the rules and this is what I follow, right? I mean, life changes, things change, and you gotta ebb and flow with the tides. So they all have trade-offs. I like the guardrails. I use a form of them myself, and I think it's just about doing your research, understanding all these different types of distribution strategies. There's also annuities as a way to take care of some of this distribution strategies in retirement and mitigate risks. I'm not advocating for them or against them, but they are available to play into this stuff. And it gets really complicated and convoluted quickly. Obviously, this is self-promoting, but I do think in retirement, more so than any other time of your life, especially the accumulation phase, but in retirement, it's worth reaching out to a financial advisor or somebody if you're unsure, if you don't really understand, what your approach is, to just get a second opinion and get an idea of how you're going to approach it. You need a plan. Even if that plan changes, you should have some sort of plan in place. How am I going to be invested? How am I going to manage distributions in retirement? And even if that plan changes, at least you have something you're kind of working towards, some sort of parameters that you're following. All right, I think we'll leave it off there. That is the dynamic distribution strategy in a nutshell. Again, very high level. We didn't go into details of all the different ones out there, but we'll leave it there. If there's anything in particular you'd like me to talk about on the show going forward, email it over to aloha@hawaiiretirementshow.com, and we'll catch everyone on the next one.
The opinions and statements presented on this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations. Never make any investment or financial decisions based on information offered on this show without first consulting your financial, legal, or tax advisor. All economic and performance information mentioned on the show is historical in nature and is not indicative of any future results. All indices mentioned on this show are unmanaged and cannot be invested in directly. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. Lastly, all opinions expressed by Jason Katita and any guests on the show are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of or are endorsed by ToBA Financial. For Jason Katita, investment advisory services are offered through ToBA Financial LLC, a registered investment advisor offering advisory services in the state of Hawaii and in other jurisdictions where exempt from registration.